Invisible Experts Podcast.
Welcome everyone to a new episode of this podcast, Invisible Experts. Today's conversation is particularly special as we are joined by two guests who have already been part of this journey and have contributed significantly to some of our earlier discussions. I'm really pleased to welcome back Dr. Knife and Dr. Dixon, who previously joined us in episode 6 and 4 respectively. Both bring a powerful combination of academic rigor and lived experience. They are deeply engaged in research around sustainable development, social enterprises, sustainable enterprises, and this kind of concept of broader socioeconomic dynamics shaping the Caribbean and the global South. Their work consistently challenges dominant models of development and invite us or make us think differently to rethink how we understand economy, community, and sustainability. In this episode of today, we're going to explore the recent chapter on Rastafari Livity and sustainable enterprise, an approach that brings forward a much deeper, eco-centric, and philosophical perspective on sustainability. What makes this particularly interesting is that it doesn't come from mainstream Western frameworks, but instead from a lived system of values and practices that have been evolving for decades. So today, we are going to unpack what this really means in practice and what we can learn from it, and how it might challenge the way we currently think about development and businesses. Both of you, Dr. Knife and Dr. Dixon, it's great to have you both back. How are you?
Hey, I give thanks. And it's always
Thank
good
you.
to connect and reason.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Listen, let's start from each of you, right? Anyone can talk if you wish. To start, I would love to go a little bit personal, you know? So what led you both to explore Rastafari, not just as a movement, but as a way of life connected to sustainability and entrepreneurship?
Well, let me start first then, Andres. And of course, my liberty is Rastafari. I embrace that liberty. You know, but you see, as a youth growing up in Jamaica, in particular, also attending my high school was called St. George's College, which is a very Catholic, is the biggest Catholic institution in the region as a high school. And quite strangely, when you're attending that school and being exposed to a number of things, you start to question the things that you're seeing around you. Because a Catholic school is actually run by a priest, the Jesuit institution. You know, and you're there at the school learning history and understand the role that the Jesuits has played in not just colonization, but enslavement of both the physical and the minds of Jamaicans and Caribbean people. You start to understand the role that the church has used religion as a tool and politics as a tool to continue to disempower people. And this is as a young person at high school. We went to high school at the age of 10 and 11 when we were exposed to these things in some of the texts that we have read, you know, and the researches that were being exposed as students in high school. So, for example, you have read something like The Royal Hunt of the Sun, and you could learn how the priests came across with Cortez and destroyed the Aztecs civilization. You have learned from books like The Pearl, or again, they came and exploited persons in the Americas, the traditional people in the Americas. You know, you have learned about when Columbus came here, and we know that the first person that was approved to be on the trip with Columbus was the priest. So you realize the role that the church had played. However, the only set of persons that as a youth we could clearly remember that was speaking the truth about this kind of reality would have been the Rastaman. And then we recognize that the Rastaman were being excluded and vilified in Jamaica. We were actually taught as youths that you should stay away from the Rasta man, as Bunny Wheeler would have sung in his song, The Black Heart Man, on the album, The Black Heart Man. They have a song which says that the Black Heart Man will come and take you away, giving you candies and taking you away, kidnapping you. Yes? When I'm inviting persons, Andre to get that album, to listen to it online, the Black Heart Man album by Bunny Wheeler. It was produced in 1976. He explained all that you could have seen him to Rastafari. So in truth and in fact, now as a young person who was on a path of trying to understand your own reality, the only people I could see that reflected the things that I was thinking about and I was learning about was the Rastafari family. And those are the persons who the society treated as outcasts. Again, I also grow in an underserved community, which is Arnett Garden. And Arnett Garden is in the Kingston area. And Rastafari emerged, especially around that area of West Kingston, spreading out to East Kingston. And Arnett Garden, which is called Trenchtown, was a heart of that kind of reality as well, And so we learned, well, I learned as a youth, that the people that they were blaming the most, the people that we were treating as outcasts, were the persons who showed the most love in the society. Because as a youth, every time there was a Rasta man who was greeting anybody at all, Rasta or non-Rasta, you know what the word he used? Love I. Each time him greet you, him say love I. So there was always promoting this idea of love. That's even so much so that these were adopted by politicians like a Michael Mann in the 1970s who used a slogan that the word is love. But those are things that the Rastafari community was actually saying. So for me personally, Rastafari reflected my own ideals and philosophy and what I was looking for as a young person, growing up in an underserved community, where even my community, once persons where you came from Arnett Garden, you were discriminated against. So even if I was not Rastafari, you were discriminated against because of where you come from. So you could easily identify with the reality of a Rasta person. But importantly, Rastafari represented a group of people where despite all the challenges that they were facing, they were very strong persons, but also the only persons who I think actually showed a kind of unconditional love towards the rest of the Jamaican society, even though they were fighting against them. I think that's what attracted me the most to the whole liberty of Rastafari as a very young person. As you grow and you start to learn more about the work of Marcus Garvey and his idea of self-reliance, and the work of Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, where he was consolidating all of Ethiopia, then you recognize that this is who you are. Rastafari is not something that you become, Rastafari is what you manifest, meaning that liberty of Rastafari, I think, is in everyone and every being. But it comes out at different points in time for different persons and manifests itself in different ways and means in different persons, So it's a part of self-actualization, it's a part of self-realization. So over time, I embrace who I truly am from my own perspective, not from somebody else's perspective, and embracing a liberty that will allow me to do and be what I want to do and be who I want to be.
Great. How about you, Ed? So basically, before you talk, so Rastafari, back in the day, was considered like a boogeyman.
Very much so.
Okay.
And the worst kind of boogeyman you could think about, that a regular boogeyman.
How about you, Ed?
Yeah. So I guess you've gotten it from Knife in terms of his own lived experience. And I think that's probably the most natural way you're going to get it in terms of the connection. But for me, I think a couple of things, just thinking through the question and listening to Knife, there are a couple of things, and I jot them down whilst Knife was talking in terms of my own experience. The first one is that in like upper school, I had to do, well, I chose to do a SBA on Rastafari, and I had the chance to kind of, go up to the Bob Marley Museum and some other places to kind of get some information. So before, in terms of how religious education is taught in schools, it's 90% of it is about Christianity and then 10% about the other religions, right? And I guess I said, I wouldn't call it a religion, but it's usually clumped into that religious area. And so, that within that 10% of the curriculum, you were able to kind of explore other religious beliefs. And I said, myself and one of my friends chose to do our assignment on Rastafari, and it kind of opened my mind to kind of understand a little bit more. Because as I said before, if you were going to wait on the educational institutions to kind of provide you with information on the other religious beliefs and practices, you would be left disappointed, because as I said before, 90% of it was really about telling me about Christianity, and so on. So, I was able to learn a lot more and appreciate a lot more about, just the Livity by doing that assignment that I had to do it would be grade 10. Right, so that was one thing. The other thing was, for me, from a lived experience perspective, the persons who lived Rastafari in my community were often seen as really the arbiters of peace. They were very, so if you wanted somebody to give you an unbiased approach to life, anything you're facing, you would go and talk to a senior Rastafari, right? And that's somebody who would give you, as I said before, a very balanced view on life. They're not too constrained by, certain thought processes that, another person would be. So if you went to another religious leader, but in terms of the Rastafari, it would give you really based on their own lived experience from life. And so people really gravitated towards their kind of understanding of life and how to live, especially living with others and so on. So that was another thing. So I was able to see from afar kind of how they kind of conducted themselves and how they advised others about life and how to live with others, So that was another point raised. I lived, we mentioned Pinnacle in the chapter, and where I lived was not too far from Pinnacle, right, as a community. Actually, what happened was that many of the persons who ended up living in my community were some of the descendants of persons who actually lived at Pinnacle. So when the government went in and dismantled Pinnacle, the persons then left and came to my community. So many of them already had kind of the belief systems that they would have encountered in Pinnacle, and you'd always hear them talking about gun, and this is Leonard Howell we spoke about in the chapter. And so a lot of their practices were kind of influenced by the living, the ideologies, the thought processes, the practices of Pinnacle, right? So again, as I said, just thinking through my own experiences and and listening to Knife talk, I was able to kind of see some of those as well. Personally, for me as well, just how Rastafari challenged and questioned the status quo was something that was very interesting to me. In my readings, I was able to see why the government, from the colonial government to other government, actually feared Rastafari, right? So they embrace this idea of the black identity, and they lived it. It's not they didn't just embrace it; they lived it through their own lives. So you could see it in terms of their dress and just how they thought through what they call the Babylon system, just the challenge to the approaches, the things the things that governments and other established systems, how it disadvantaged regular persons in the society. And so through the music you were able to hear a lot of the how they rebelled against this system, right? And so the identity, and how they lived it. So they actually went against a lot of what was considered to be traditional and, how we were supposed to live, right? So they were really, as I said, they not just spoke about it, they actually lived it through, just how they lived. And as a final point for me here would be how they approached nutrition and diet, right? So in this day and age where we have a lot around non-communicable diseases, from ever since you'd have heard of the Rastafari way of life where, they didn't eat certain, meats generally, and I guess we can talk about kind of just the differences. There's some who eat like fish and so on. But the approach to nutrition that we're now seeing today as a part of, this whole health revolution that we see going on now in society, where people are, more conscious about what they eat and understand the connection between what they eat and, how it affects them in terms of their health. And so for me, those are probably just some of the areas for me where, just the how Rastafari as a movement and as a lived experience, kind of impacted or influenced my own thought processes around, issues of sustainability broadly, and we'll probably talk about issues of the environment a bit later, but also around entrepreneurship. So, you always see the Rastafari, persons coming to your community, and we get this idea of them, selling brooms. And I think when we talk about this, the idea of them, having because of the way in which they were treated, they had to come up with alternate enterprise approaches, right? So they were not accepted in the traditional workforce because of some of their practices. And so that then caused them to have to become entrepreneurial. They had to use the resources that were available to them. And you see them broadly in the creative and cultural industry because that's a space that they were able to, I'd probably say they really kind of took on that era because I guess in many respects it started out as being an informal area, but they formalized it in many ways. And so this is an area that they were able to kind of be themselves in. They were able to share with people their practices, their traditional approaches, and their thought processes through the music as well. And so they kind of made that area their own and so on. So those were kind of some of the areas for me that, there were connections between my own personal journey and things that I saw from the Rastafari movement.
That's amazing, guys.
One
But
second,
also, knife
Let me plug
and
Let me plug in the-
yeah, please, go ahead. Go.
Oh, you probably went up. Go ahead.
It's okay. No, I was asking, man. Listen, one aspect from my perspective, right, which I found fascinating. Maybe you guys touch it upon, but you don't go deep. And is this relationship of Rastafari with psychedelics?
With
Psychedelics.
psychedelics.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm gonna actually elaborate why. Because if you think about it, in generally speaking, the West always champion, let's say reason, facts, science, and this kind of rationalized understanding of the world, no? Through research, through their methods, and so on, But how about this unconscious part that we have as humans, And I would argue that also the use of psychedelics also, helped to explore other perspectives that our mind cannot. You see what I'm trying to say? Like, if you think about
let me
it,
tell you something. There's something that Rastafari argued. Rastafari argued that Rastafari do not believe, Rastafari know. I will also argue that
okay,
Rastafari, the being, you, the individual, is the first book. Yes? So the argument is that all that you need to know is contained within self. And therefore, accepting self and self-knowledge is extremely important. Now, when you observe the ideas of other Eastern societies, you'll find this to be true as well. So, for example, in the Raja Yogi principle, they will speak of the I consciousness, which Rastafari speak of as I as well, where one embraces self, and the I consciousness, where one recognizes there is a connection with everything that exists within this three-dimensional space and the non-three-dimensional space. And therefore, the objective is to tap into that self. And once you tap into yourself, you start to be exposed to everything else. And so we embrace the idea that the fundamental difference between knowledge and wise mind is intuition, that which comes out of self, and not necessarily that which comes out of a book, which is secondary information. So it places primacy on self-knowledge, but also teaches you to respect self-knowledge of other persons as well. Because we realize that every being is connected, and therefore whatever limitations you place on other beings, you also place upon yourself. So you must learn to respect your own knowledge by reading your first book, which is yourself, but also the knowledge of other persons as well. And so that is where you find that Rastafari, so even though we might be using these plants, like a ganja plant, which aids you in tapping into certain parts of your system. For example, that your body is designed with an endocannabinoid system, which are receptors for the cannabis plant. And a lot of the receptors are concentrated in your brain and also in your liver. And the ones in your brain are linked into places like your rhinocephalus, some of the ancient parts of your brain, like your pineal gland and your pituitary gland, which is also linked into this kind of extra sensory perceptive kind of thing. Yes? And not only Rastafari would have used it, you'd have seen the connection with this in places like Ethiopia and in many other societies as well, where those things are used as part of their practices. And Rastafari was using this not because they know that other person are using it, Rastafari was using it because it becomes a part of our life. We couldn't tell that it was being used in Egypt and in India, in all these places. We could tell you no. No, they weren't thinking about that. They were seeing the plant as a part of their own self as well. And some of them were influenced also by what came out of the Bible, because in Rastafari, you have ones who are linked into some religious teachings as seen in the Bible, while others are not. For those who were using the Bible, they were saying that the ganja plant, the cannabis plant, is called the weed of wisdom, and Solomon used to use it, and so you get wise. Others would know that once you keep yourself attuned, because you have a lot of Rastafari ones who do not use herb as well, and they are very intuitive as well. But they say once you keep yourself aligned and in tune with earth, all that you need to know will come to you. Yes? So we really embrace that kind of idea, which says that when the master is ready, when the student is ready, the master will appear. But that's not a master who's external. What you're saying is that when the student accepts that they themselves has that master within self, that is when the master truly appears. So self-acceptance is the most important step towards self-actualization. And that self-acceptance means truly accepting that you are also a reservoir of knowledge, just as though everyone else is a part of that reservoir of knowledge. And it is a connection amongst I and I now as people, which allows you to self-actualize. So you can't be somebody who's on a path of self-actualization where everybody else is on a path of non-self-actualization. No, it doesn't work like that. The idea is to move, and while you're moving, we're also helping each other to move forward. So it's the same idea of the collective, the self-reliance of empowering self, but collective responsibility of empowering others as well to empower themselves.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And also, if you think about it, there is a lot of, let's say, like worldwide connection with the use of plants, right? And
Yes.
nature. And I think
Yes.
this is when sustainability comes alive, in the practice. And as you put it in the chapter, Livity of, such a philosophy of life as Rastafari. Because even in the Andes, it's the same, the use of ayahuasca,
Right.
things like that, because you don't know, you have this kind of self of consciousness of who you are, and by acknowledging who you are, you can extend to the
Exactly.
others in order to live, right? But also, like, if you think about it, the yogis also use plants. The
Exactly.
Chinese, they use
Exactly.
their plants. The
Exactly.
Pacific, indigenous, they also use plants.
That's exactly. We
So
were speaking as plants. Plants is a natural connection to man. And that is why within Rastafari practice as a practice, not to wear things that are not made from plants. So note, we'll walk without shoes when we're on the dirt because we want to connect to the earth.
Yes.
We're only natural fibers. Long before we start to think about microplastics and all these things in the synthetic materials like the polyester, we were saying, no, you should wear only natural fibers because you want to keep yourself connected to the earth, natural vibration. We were saying we do not kill animals. Let me put it like this. We do not murder animals because there's a big difference between murdering an animal and killing an animal. What do I mean by this? I will see other traditional societies who hunt and them fish and them use that as part as your live, that as a game. You're not taking pleasure from killing a goat or a sheep or a fish. That is part of your live, and so they treat those animals with respect, as against in the West now, where we think it's a game to go and shoot bird and to go and hunt some deer as a game. Yes, but Rastafari, while we respect that of other persons, for I personally live, we do not believe in murdering animals because what we do is murder animals in the West. Yes? And so we don't wear the things that are made from the animals that are murdered. So we do not wear leather products, whether it be a shoes or a belt or a bag. Note, not that to say that Rastafari people don't do, but I talk as a liberty. It is accepted that you have Rastafari people who do not do these things because of the negative that is associated with the act of murdering an animal. So we embrace. So you'll find that I do not keep a fish tank or a bird cage because I consider a fish tank to be a fish prison. Yes? I would not keep a bird cage because it's a prison as well. But what you want to do, because I like birds, you plant your yard with a lot of fruit trees. Because if you have a lot of fruit trees, a lot of birds will naturally come into your yard. So you don't need a cage. Yes? If you like fishes and water, you live at places where we live in the mountains or we live near rivers. And so you can have those kind of natural kind of setting. The point we're making is that it teaches a respect for all life form on the earth, across plants and animals. And we recognize that man is an animal within the animal kingdom. And unfortunately, man out of all animals have the worst behavior on the face of the earth. We are the only animals on the face of the earth that destroys the environment and destroys other things that are part of that natural environment as well. But the idea is to embrace all that is natural because you're connected. See, and so if I get up in the morning, I've just finished weeding because I have a garden, and when I weed, I'm weeding without my shoes because I know that I'm connected to the earth. And as I weed in the morning, I'm also breathing all those oxygen that is coming from all those plants. So you see, right away, I am consuming, because I know that the food that we consume the most is air. Air is a single food that we consume the most as plants and animals on the earth. So you recognize how important it is then, therefore, not to be polluting the place, because air is what you consume. The first thing you consume as a child when you're born is air. The last thing you consume as a person when you're leaving the earth is air. The first breath and the last breath. So you see how important it is now not to be polluting the atmosphere, not to be cutting down the trees, not to be causing harm to things around you. So it's not a big, complicated thing, you know. It's very simple. Rastafari embrace the principle based on the law of life. Everything that is pro-life, we will support. Things that are anti-life, we do not support. And it's as simple as that. It don't take a lot of writings or readings. But if you are pro-life, you'll find that your actions tend to be positive with all the natural environment around you. When you're anti-life, your actions tend to be negative with all the things around you. I think that's the simplest way we could actually.
No, that was very profound, bro. Okay, so let's start before we go deeper, but for our audience. How
Yes.
would you summarize the core ideas of your chapter and what it's really about?
Eddie, you want to start and then I can follow?
Right, so we do probably take this one first. As you know, naturally, we probably want you to start off this one. So go, you take this one.
All right. So the idea of the chapter, remember we were thinking about how do we establish models for sustainability within developing nations. And so we spoke of Rastafari as a philosophy and ethic that support what is called sustainable enterprises, you know, which goes beyond the traditional discourse now surrounding social enterprise, where social enterprise are mission driven, and at the core of the social enterprise mission is the social mission. The sustainable enterprise, I think, is broader and deeper than a social enterprise. And at the core of the sustainable enterprise is the ecosystem. How do we ensure that we are going to create sustainable value, but also sustain the source of that value creation, which is the entire ecosystem? And so you can see why, you know, that is such a strong connection within my Livity as Rastafari. Because as Rastafari, at the center of our Livity is what we call aeration. Aeration, which is different from creation. Creation is what man has impacted in the way they have impacted it negatively. Aeration is trying to keep and maintain what we call this earth in its most pristine and natural state. And therefore, the idea of sustainable enterprises synchronizes more with our mindset, yes, of value creation, whether it be economic value, social value, cultural value, or environmental value creation. We're doing it in a way that actually improves the natural environment rather than destroys the natural environment. So that is the primary focus. How do we see Rastafari as a philosophy, an ethic, and a livity that through the use of sustainable enterprises supports what is called sustainable development? And so we have a more eco-centric approach as against this human-centered anthropocentric approach.
Okay, fantastic. Eddie, do you
Yeah,
wanna
I think that kind of summarizes it in terms of the importance of centering the environment, I think, is a critical component. So if you'd have gone to the chapter, you'd have seen how we would have compared the different houses or mansions of Rastafari and their own connections to, you know, how their philosophy, their approach to life would then reflect on how, you know, we kind of then projected that onto the idea of sustainable enterprises. So we tried to show how the different houses would have manifested their philosophies towards life generally, and how that would then kind of connect to sustainable business. And that's kind of what we try to do by also mapping the emergence of Rastafari, because I think our thought process was that you wouldn't be able to understand that liberty of Rastafari without understanding where it came from, its emergence. And so we ensured that you were able to see, how it emerged, and we always put in there the element where there was this antagonistic relationship between the emergence of Rastafari and the government and government operatives. So the emergence of the thought process of Rastafari was always confronted, challenged by the state, and understanding, just how that would have impacted on how the thought process is evolved as well is a big part of it. So it was always being constrained by a state that was not comfortable with it, with what they were thinking, how they were thinking, and what that meant for the state itself. So they always had that as a constraint behind, what they did as a way of life. And just that way of life and how it challenged the traditional thinking is a big part of the chapter as well.
Yeah, 100%. Actually, like when I've read the chapter, I think it goes beyond the usual religious or socio-political lens. I think what made you feel, or what I feel, it was important how you guys highlight these environmental and philosophical dimensions of Rastafari Livity, right?
Yeah.
So why you guys think is important to highlight such a both dimensions, the environmental and philosophical dimensions of Rastafari Livity?
Andres, this is crucial, because when you think about developing countries, the status quo consistently argues about the exploitation of resources to generate primarily economic value creation. And it is being done in a way that doesn't embrace any ideas relating to equity or social justice, or it's about self-interest. Just as how we were having a discussion earlier about Hobbesian philosophy of how the environment is harsh and cold, etc. That's exactly what we practice in the Caribbean. We have a very neoliberalist kind of mindset, which thinks that big imported capitalists and capitalist practice are going to solve problems for our country. And that has never happened for 400, nearly 500 years. We have been doing these kinds of things that has never transformed the quality of lives of our people. And therefore, we have to find a way that is more sustainable. And within the idea of sustainability, it embraces the things of equity and inclusivity and all those things that we know go beyond the regular traditional neoclassical economic framework. That just won't work for us. It will never work and has never worked. What we realize as well, though, is that when we examine practices of traditional people, even outside of Rastafari, whether it be the Kalinago people in Dominica, whether it would have been the Garvey people from out of St. Vincent who are now in Belize, whether it be the Taino people who are across the region, you find that the way these people live is one which goes against what we have as contemporary economic practices. And you'll find that in those societies, the challenges that you'll have in a regular capitalist, neoliberalist kind of setup. You just don't have those. And so we're saying we need to shift. Rastafari has always argued in what we call Nyabingi. Nyabingi is a chant that we chant at our own ceremonies that we have. And at the head of the chant is the idea of we need to get rid of the head of the church and the state. Because the head of the church and the state, which is religion and politics, is what perpetuates this plantation system that persistently disempowers our people and cause them to be in a state of poverty. That's what we argue straight at the bingy. It actually says death to all black and white down pressers. Let me repeat that. In the Nyabingi, the focal point of the Nyabingi ceremony is what I'm saying, death to all black and white down pressers. And death can be both physical, metaphysical. What they're saying is that you need to destroy that system, which is a system that comes out of Rome, which regularly we call a Babylonian system, but it's really a Roman system that we need to destroy. And so the embracing now of a more earth-centered philosophy, we are saying, will promote the kind of equity that you want. It can create the kind of wealth that you want to create, whether it be value through economic value, as I say, by social value, cultural value, or environmental value. You can do all of that in a very sustainable way, which doesn't cause a conflict to what takes place within creation itself. So it is very, very crucial, because everything is governed by a philosophy. Everything is governed by your ethic. The way you see resources, the way you see people, the processes that you adopt, the way you think about distribution of resources and wealth, all that is governed by your own philosophy. So if you have a very selfish, self-interest philosophy, as we are taught in neoclassical economics by Adam Smith's idea of the invisible, there's no invisible hand that is going to make anything better for our people. We have not seen that for 500 years. Trickle-down models do not work. Trickle-down models do not work. Those models are models that maintain that exploitative relationship. And I'm saying to you, whether it be a capitalist model on the one hand, or a very leftist model on the other hand, you're going to have problems. Because in the leftist ideology, with Marxian ideologies, there's the idea of what is called a vanguard. And we have seen that in the University of the West Indies where we are. Where during the 1970s, these persons didn't embrace Marcus Garvey's idea nor Rastafari. They embraced leftist ideologies. And they themselves think that they were some kind of vanguard, which means they have this kind of divine right to govern because they have some amount of education over the rest of the population. And when we look at it, the extreme left and the extreme right are one and the same. And if you understand the principle of polarity, if you travel as far east as you can travel, yes, where do you think you're going to end up?
West.
But west. It is one and the same. It's just different rates of vibration. We are saying get rid of that altogether. That has never worked and will never work. That was not designed to work for our people. So you have to find the solutions to your problems from within yourselves and around your neighbors and from people who have a very similar historical experience. That's why the South-South discourse becomes crucial, because people in the South have had a very similar kind of experience by interfacing with people from the North. And the thing that has worked for us as people in the South has been the things that our people have created organically from our lived experience. But those has never become a part of the mainstream. Why is it so? Because the key decision makers in the mainstream are socialized and educated by the same shit stream that perpetuates oppression. That is why we are saying to destroy the system. And that is why you'll find that people in the university later on, in what is called the New World Movement in the early 1960s, you had a group of them, a small group of them, which include people like Lloyd Best and Carl Levitt and Norman Gervan and George Beckford, who called themselves the plantation economists. And their thesis was that we need to destroy the plantation system. Note, that's an idea that came out of Rastafari, you know. But they have never read any papers written by those persons who made reference to Rastafari as a group of people who advanced the idea of destroying the plantation economy and the plantation system. But it was clear among some of our Caribbean scholars that we need to destroy the system. Unless it is going to be destroyed, you're going to have this called persistent poverty. as written by George Bedford in his text Persistent Poverty in 1973. Yeah. You know, so we have to do something like that, Andrews. You have to embrace your own people. You have to learn to appreciate the brain of your own people. You have to learn to appreciate the experiences of your people. Because who do you think have more interest in you? Do you think that a stranger from a colonial experience that have for hundreds of years exploited our people, do you think that that stranger have more interest in your people's development than your own people? That is impossible. But you have been taught not to value the ideas, the ethic, the philosophy, and the practices of our people. And we should import, and in the worst case scenario, copy and paste the practices of people from a very totally different historical experience that have no real relevance to our own development agenda.
Great. You know, yes, go ahead.
I think for me, I've always said that there is no value neutral policy, right? So all policies are underlined, guided by some philosophy or worldview, right? And we spoke earlier about the Hobbesian approach and how that influenced the approach to conquest and imperialism, the approach to economy and economy, you know, how they frame the economy. Again, we spoke that it is a situation where the fittest of the fittest, the strongest is the one, and so the strong will always exploit the weak. So if you take that as a given in terms of how the philosophy is structured, then you'll understand why we chose to emphasize, this philosophical dimension and the environmental component of Rastafari Livity in our chapter, right? So we understand that the system has been designed with a particular philosophy in mind that essentially will damage the earth to kind of ensure their own continuance. And it's a very, as we said, a very zero-sum approach, right? So the idea is, so I think Knife mentioned earlier the idea of subsistence living, where as a hunter-gatherer society, you'd take just the amount that you need from the society, right, in terms of plants and animals, right? But what we understand the capitalist system to be is take as much as you can and don't think about tomorrow, right? So you have a situation where you're doing things like commercial fishing, and you're taking a whole lot of fish out of the ocean and not giving it a chance to replenish itself, right? So that's the mentality. The mentality is we have created big ships. Let us take as much as the ship can hold, as opposed to the point of view that use just what you need in order to ensure that there's enough for tomorrow. So you can see the difference in terms of the philosophy and how this is manifested in policy and institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and so on.
There's an additional concern here because it is linked, Andres, into the religious practices that feeds into them ethics. So, for example, we know that persons who are very strong Western Christian practitioners believe that what they call God give them dominion over all things on the earth to use as they want. They'll actually go further to argue that because God soon return for his earth, there's really no need to practice these things that you call sustainability either, because ultimately, in their Christian story, God is going to come to destroy the earth again, which he had done before the water within their religious stories. Now he's going to destroy it with fire. So if you ask yourself, if you accept that to be true, that you're awaiting the return of a God, who when he's going to return, he's going to come with brimstone and fire to destroy the earth, to build a new earth. Why do you need to sustain it? So you can see why the religion, the ethic, and the philosophy guides their practices. Even what we see today in these wars that are taking place, it is a religious, philosophy-guided war which supports them economic, political agenda. So you have persons who are saying that they are chosen people and they must get rid of the people who are infidels. And at the same time, you want to control the resources that those people have in the lands that the infidels actually have. You see? So you can see where the religion and the politics, which is the church and the state, goes hand in hand. And if you embrace a religious philosophy that is not anchored in the idea of sustainability, you're going to have political and economic practices that are not reflected in the ideas of sustainability as well. Because ultimately, what man in the West fear is them concept of what is called God. And if your God have a culture of exploitation and wars, and you're going to read that Western book, which is called the Bible, there's nobody or no character in that religious text that has killed more people, that has caused more harm to the environment, that has discriminated against women and men and youth than the God in the Western Bible. And so we argue that it is man who made God in their own image. And they personify, if you look at the Bible, the personification of God in the Bible reflects the practices of a lot of the world leaders who call themselves Christians. If you don't agree with God, him kill you. If you don't agree with certain governments, them drop bombs on your country. In the name of God too. So we're saying that it requires a total shift in the mindset where we recognize that we are part of this universal consciousness and oneness where we share a common space which is called Earth. And Earth in itself is so perfect that if we live in tune with the laws of creation, which is about how to sustain and perpetuate life, we have no challenges. The problems that we face today in our societies are not problems created by the earth. These are problems created by men who embrace a particular kind of mindset and a certain kind of philosophy. And I said there's a shifting of the mind, as we'll argue in the text, what is called the Kybalion, the 7 principles of mental intelligence. That all is the mind, the universe is mental. And therefore, the way we think, the thoughts that we harbor, the things that we direct through our thoughts reflect our day-to-day life. And if you have a thought process which is selfish, who thinks negatively, things in a very oppressive way, your behavior is going to reflect that today. So if we want to shift the paradigm, we have to shift the mindset.
Yeah, actually, one of the key ideas that you propose in your chapter is that Rastafari embodies an eco-centric way of living, right?
Exactly.
And it goes long before sustainability became such a global agenda. So, in simple terms, guys, what is Rastafari Livity and how does it relate to sustainability? Simply.
Again, law of life. Very, very simple. We must do things that perpetuates and sustain life. So you use resources in the most effective and efficient way. It's almost like a concept called Factor 4 by Weizsäcker, where Weizsäcker argued that you can use half as much to get twice as much. So we're saying that you want to use the clearest form of technology. Yes? You want to think about the best way of distributing resources. Yes? You want to think about how we pass on this kind of knowledge to other generations so it becomes a normal part of your life. It doesn't have to be something that keep reminding persons about. So the law of life, which is the law of how to live, we embrace what is called a kind of enlightened self-interest, which means that while I am doing things to support who I am living, I recognize that my actions also impact all the other beings around me. And if I can do things that improve my life positively, I can also do things that improve the quality of life of every other being around us as well.
Yeah. So you guys contrast anthropocentric and
Yes.
eco-centric worldviews, right? So
Yes.
how does Rastafari challenge such a dominant human-centered way of thinking about development and business?
All right. Again, remember, I know, Rastafari is really a livity. And so it's not just about in the talking. It's about in actual practice. So you know then, everywhere we go in the Jamaican and the Caribbean space, people are saying we need to do this because it's going to impact the life of people. And we're saying, yes, everything impacts the life of people. But you'll find that if you don't put the environment at the center, your outcomes are going to be suboptimal. We're arguing that if I am planting, so for example, we talk about food sovereignty. Yes? In the Caribbean, we have more people who are killed in the Caribbean from consumption of bad food than from gun violence. But in the Caribbean, this is caused because of how we practice agriculture. We use a lot of
Pesticides and herbs.
fertilizers and pesticides and poisons that are now causing serious cancers within many farmers. And what Rastafari is saying, no, you must farm what is called ITAL food. ITAL food, and we actually create an ITAL standard. We have drafted an ITAL standard. ITAL food means using only natural occurring things within your production processes. So, if I want to get nitrates for my plants, I'm going to use potash, which is something which comes from lumber. When lumber is burned, because we burn a lot of fires, you know. I'm going to use plants like comfrey or nettle because they're very high in nitrates. Yes? If I want to use an insecticide, I'm going to observe within my garden the plants that insects do not trouble, and therefore makes a solution from those plants to spray on the other plants as well. So we're going to only use natural things in what we're doing. Yes? And so you shift the focus from the human-centered user value, instrumental value, to an approach that says that when we really treat the environment as a center, we actually get more for your human consumption than if you were focused on just satisfying your human consumption. So essentially, we're saying if you treat the environment well, you'll always get more from the environment than if you're just focusing on treating yourself well. And this we have the proof and the evidence of consistently. You cannot, and Andres, I'm going to invite you to come to Jamaica at some point in time, but I want you to come when there's like fruit seasons. You cannot eat off one mango tree. The amount of mangoes that are going to be wasted. You cannot eat off one pepper tree. So what's the point I'm making? If we focus on planting for the support of the environment, the amount of food that is generated from what you're planting is significantly more than what you require for your own consumption. But if you're planting just to sell, and the focus becomes on the money, you might end up not planting enough because you're thinking, oh, if you have an oversupply, the price is going to fall and the revenue is going to fall. No. What you want to do is a plant so much that the supply is so great that the price remains affordable so people can consume, and you have enough to store in the post-harvest. That's even in a situation where there's natural hazards that cause shortages, you have more than enough to support what you want to support. So the mindset is a long view. You know, Rastafari speak of what is called far eye, putting on the word far eye. And far eye means the long view, looking into the future. How do we do things that goes beyond today? That's why the idea of what is called sustainable development, we have challenged it in my PhD work because I recognize that the definition of sustainable development that came out of the Brundtland Commission in 1984 was very human-centered. As a matter of fact, it spoke about inter and not intergenerational equity. So we're speaking about equity across generation, but we're not even addressing inequity within the current generation. Yes? So we have to redefine, because we recognize that the space in which that term emerged still did not embrace the environment in its totality. And we have seen that subsequent to that, they have shifted the definition of sustainable development to include some of these concerns that I as Rastafari have spoken about. If you go further, you'll find that the creed of Rastafari, it says that the hungry be fed, the naked be clothed, the shelterless be sheltered, the sick be nourished, the aged protected, and the infants cared for, are things that we see reflected with not only our national vision, but also the sustainable development goals. Where the first 6 goals are zero hunger, zero poverty, access to education and healthcare, access to sanitation and water, gender equality. You know, so we are saying these things are there. But what I want you to know, Diana Andres, is that while we are speaking of Rastafari, these are not things that are unique to Rastafari only. I am saying that our peoples across the globe that are indigenous people that embrace long-time traditional practices all embrace a similar kind of mindset and attitude towards the environment. Where we're thinking about the collective as against the individual. You know, the idea, this anthropocentric, human-centered, instrumental value approach is something that emerged primarily out of a Euro-American experience, which again links back into the Hobbesian philosophy of the thinking that the environment is harsh and wicked towards them. We are saying no, that is not the case. Our experience is that where we are in the region where the sun shines, when I walk under a mango tree, like you see behind me, that tree naturally drops the mangoes for me to eat. I do not have to cut down the tree to get it. You know, there's no conflict between myself and a plant. When I'm at my house and my trees are ripening, I will observe the bird, and I'll observe the bird being around that tree and say, okay, knife, it is now ripening. And when I go and look, I will see that the tree is ripening because the birds are eating. So the birds now becomes a signal to me. That's what is happening around my environment. So I'm happy to see the birds. So in reality, you embrace all things around you as a signal and signs that guides you in terms of how you want to live.
Great.
Yeah. I just want to quickly add, from the other side of things, when we think about things like global warming and just how the repercussions of the actions, right? So again, in many cases, what we're seeing now in terms of persistent droughts, we're seeing weather occurrences, extreme weather occurrences. We're seeing hurricanes, we're seeing typhoons, we're seeing tsunamis, we're seeing a lot of evidence of the reaction of Mother Earth to actions that are human-centered. So actions that don't, and we've heard and seen world leaders speak to, this idea that global warming is a myth. Oh, it's a myth. And we're seeing evidence of the reaction of the earth to the practices. And so that's a part of it in terms of understanding development. So we have to see, and we have had enough evidence to see that the impact of some of these decisions that we have made, the negative impact of the decisions, both from a business standpoint and from development standpoint. We've been developing for the past 60, 70, 80 years. We've been developing, right? And so we have to start to question whether this worldview is inclusive enough to get everybody to develop, and not a situation where one set of persons are developing at the expense of another, which is what the worldview of development is. In order for some people to develop, some people have to be underdeveloped. And Walter Rodney, in his book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, speak to this in a very fulsome way. There's the same Hobbesian philosophy we're talking about from the beginning. So the worldview that in order for development to happen, some people have to be underdeveloped. So we have to exploit other people's resources in order to develop. So we want to question whether this is the model of development that will sustain, so what is the model of development that so-called emerging economies have to take? Are we going to take the same model of development that other so-called developed countries use to develop, or do we need another approach? Is what we're saying in the chapter, Andreas.
Yeah. Also, reading your chapter, guys, and having this conversation, I just realized that one of the key contributions from Rastafari to the so-called, let's say, sustainable based economy is that you give agency to everybody, right? Because as you put it before, one of the problems of the colonial mind extended through this concept of development is they don't give enough agency to the colonized, right? As they came here and we were like babies or kids or children. We were taught everything. They help us to grow up. They have brought us. They're giving us agency, right? And still happening, to the extension of this kind of neo-colonial socio-economic system, if you wish. So I think by reading through your chapter, I think it's very interesting how Rastafari contributes to this acknowledgement of the agency, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
But Andres, again, let me say this. As Rastafari, I might have a biased experience when I travel. What do I mean by this?
Okay.
When I go to places and I meet other people, again, like the Garvey people, the Kalinago people, the Taino people, the Amerindians in Guyana, I am telling you that I feel so much at home, even though I might have certain differences in terms of how we live, because the mindset is very similar. Very similar. So my own view is that our traditional practices is what is the norm. What we practice today is what has been imposed on us by these colonial persons. And so the idea of agency to the value of the knowledge that we possess as people in the South is not something that is unique to Rastafari. It is something that I find within my traditional peoples across the globe. However, Rastafari, though, has emerged as one of the biggest advocates for this agency by way of the music and how it has spread across the globe. But when you listen to what Rastafari says in the songs, you could hear the echoes of voices of many traditional peoples, many places across the globe.
Yeah.
In Asia, in India, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and the Americas. So essentially, Rastafari now becomes almost like a kind of voice who have a platform which speaks and reminds the world of the value of our peoples before Europe and America came about. So I wanted to be clear. While I know the uniqueness of Rastafari, I am saying to you that Rastafari is reflected everywhere I go when I look to my peoples who have maintained their indigenous practices. I have not met a set of persons who maintain that traditional identity and them Caribbeanness or them Americanness, who have created any form of oppression against anybody else. You tell me where you have seen a Kalinago, a Garifuna, a Maroon, a Taino, an Amerindian, or anybody who embrace that practice, who create problems for others. We don't. You might find individuals amongst us who have adopted the Euro-American philosophy and then becomes oppressor to our own people. But if you grow and appreciate and embrace the teachings of our own native people, the underlying principles surrounding love and sharing and sustainability. Everywhere you go, I find that. Now, I do not know because of my persona as Rastafari where I get this reaction from, but I strongly suspect that is not the case. I suspect that this is how our people are. We are people who believe in inclusivity, who have strong respect for the environment, and by extension, a very strong respect for our people. However, over time, many of us in decision-making positions have learned and adopted the bad behavior of Western ideologies and philosophies. And we have imposed those on our people more severely in many cases than the conquistadors themselves. You know, but I'm never deceived. You might be able, and I'm going to say this, Andres, that my people, and I'm using my word, my people to mean Caribbean and South, you can trick me as much as you want. Because I may be gullible to my people. But no one outside of those can trick me. No Euro-American person can come to me with any kind of idea to fill up my head with stupidness, and I will follow you. Let my people do that. You know? Because those are the persons who I have primary responsibility to. And I am telling you that I have never experienced in all my life any society where there are traditional peoples and those persons promote ideas of selfishness. That is not something which is intrinsic to our Livity at all.
Okay. You know, yeah, go ahead, Daddy.
Yeah, so just quickly to add there in terms of, this idea of agency, self-reliance, and collective security that Naif was mentioning. I'm just thinking about the state of the world now and what I'm seeing in terms of, approaches. So, based on, just the war and how, different imperial forces have kind of weaponized the dependencies, quote unquote, of countries across the world. We're seeing where we need, and you're starting to see kind of alignment. So persons understanding that you have to strengthen your own internal capabilities, and then you have to depend on the help of others of similar kind of societies, types, and so on. And so this idea of collective security is we're seeing it, and so that self-sufficiency, trying to make sure that you're not impacted by certain external elements in the same way continuously, is something that we have to start to really reimagine. How do we kind of insulate ourselves from certain shocks that are happening oftentimes without our input? So we're being affected by oil prices, we're being affected by wars that we have no role in, right? And so this idea of kind of building your own resiliency and connecting with your ecosystem, that again, that word, ensuring, understanding that you're a part of a broader system, and using that as a part of the way in which you navigate some of the challenges is a critical issue for businesses as well as for countries of similar emerging economy type societies. And so these are things that we have to take as real lessons in terms of how we navigate the space. Again, as we said, it's not a space that really values our input in the same way, because the idea is that we're small, we're weaker, and so our thoughts and ideas are not valid in the same way as others. And so, again, we have to start to think about how we insulate ourselves and build and reestablish certain connections and relationships that have, that can help us to navigate these external shocks.
Yeah. We have mentioned different like thinkers, philosophers, references if you wish, but you have mentioned several times Marcus Garvey, right?
Yes.
And Marcus Garvey, obviously I'm not an expert. One of the points that he made is global unity, right? Obviously, like through his, let's say, ethnicity, right? So how would you connect Marcus Garvey with Rastafari?
You want Eddie?
Right. So that's a natural kind of connection, Andrea. So a big part of Marcus Garvey's philosophy is around Black identity,
Correct.
regional pride, understanding your own worldview, your own, and how that makes it. So a big part, and I guess we have to start from, our experiences through enslavement and the philosophical challenges that it brought. So it taught many of our descendants to feel as though that we're inferior, right? And this kind of, demonstrated itself through a lot of institutions that we're a part of. So the education system perpetuated it, religion perpetuated it, the economic system perpetuated it, right? So we were more seen as resources for production rather than a critical part of the production system itself. And so and that then magnified. So the system of enslavement perpetuated that, and we saw it being established in terms of laws. So colonial laws, which ensured that, Black people could not own property. They were still seen as property, right? The idea of Jim Crow laws in America as well. So in addition to the ways in which it was done in an informal way through practices and culture, it was also institutionalized through, things like the Jim Crow laws, colonial governments, apartheid systems across the world, right? And so, and you can think about how that affected people. If say your grandparents had a particular worldview, it came through your parents and then it came to you. So in a lot of ways, this idea of the inferiority, kind of permeated aspects of our society. And so with Marcus Garvey and his philosophy, he's saying, no, so we have to see our race as being superior as well, and in and of its own right. So not in relation to anybody else, and which is how it has always been kind of perpetuated. That Garvey is saying, and again we use the same lens of the Hobbesian lens, where it's either or. So what Garvey is saying is that we can be superior in our own right and not seeing it as being you being less superior. We just want to acknowledge our people as being superior in their own manifestation. And so that in itself became a big part of that kind of became the foundation on which he built a lot of things. So culturally, economically, in terms of how we connected with other persons across the diaspora, as a big part. So if we recognize this and if we stuck together, there's a lot that we could do. And so a part of how we did that was the worldview, but also, and I think more importantly, the different business enterprises that he developed. So he not only thought it, he actually operationalized it. So he actually put it into practice to show you that when we are able to organize as one, when we're able to come together as a people with a set of objectives in mind, which is one of the things that we always had a challenge with. We didn't have this one thought that kind of brought us together to be pulling in one direction. And so he exemplified that in terms of his work. And I think similarly with Howell. Howell was able to connect the theoretical components with the practical. So it then kind of showed us that not only it is possible to think it, it is actually possible to do it. And so then brought, I think that was more powerful. And we talk about the experiential learning when we talk about entrepreneurship. So you can tell somebody how to do something, but when they actually do it, it is way more powerful when you're able to show them that they can act. It's actually being done. And so that was why Marcus Garvey and Howell was so critical. They not only were philosophers in the traditional sense of it, they were actually doers, what we call activists in terms of activity research. They actually started and did it. And so that kind of differentiates them from many persons as well.
Yeah, the reason why, sorry. I mean, the reason...
Andres, addition to what Eddie was saying, but in the context also very crucial, because Marcus Garvey emerged in the early 1900s, similar to the time that we're in now, you know, and Marcus Garvey established the UNIA and what is called the Negro Structure Corporation, African Communities League, and all those entities between 1918 and about 1922. It was actually about 4 to 5 years that Marcus Garvey had this major impact that is still resonating throughout the globe today, you know. I know that he had started just before the end of World War I in 1919, and when the war ended, there were still discussions about people going into Africa to get resources to rebuild Europe. And what Marcus saw was the opportunity for a South-South development program between Africans in Africa and Africans in the diaspora. Marcus Garvey was also aware of Rastafari, you know, and this is Rastafari who later was currently as Haile Selassie. Rastafari as a young person in Africa, doing a lot of work as well, and was actually supporting Marcus Garvey's big convention, I think in 1921 in the United States. You know, and so what Marcus saw was that unless African people become economically, politically, and socially empowered, especially through the economics, they could never make any meaningful change in their lives, and will always remain at the bottom of the ladder in terms of the society. And so he created that model, and the model was based upon collective ownership of businesses, not individual ownership of businesses. We argue that Marcus Garvey created what was the first transnational global social enterprise and to create the first crowdfunding platform, because he had over 4 million members of his organizations. I mean, he was going to buy the ships for the Black Stallion shipping companies. He was actually selling shares. Sold over 200,000 shares at $5 each and generated over $1 million to support the buying of those ships that were owned collectively. And so the idea was to establish trade between the South in the Americas and, of course, Africa, which became a major threat to the status quo. Because note that after World War I, a lot of countries in Europe were destroyed. Where were they planning to get their resources? Out of Africa. And the same people who controlled Firestone, who went into Liberia, yes, which I think was Rothschild, those persons. Those are the persons who, along with other persons in the United States, actively made efforts to destroy the UNIA. Eddie mentioned Howell. Know that Howell and Marcus was actually in the same time period as well, having similar experiences in the Americas. And it was Marcus Garvey who stated that Black people in the West must look towards Africa, because when there's a crowning of the king in Africa, their redemption is near. So the pronouncement of Marcus Garvey was a very important pronouncement for the emergence of Rastafari as a movement as well. And Marcus Garvey coined the phrase self-reliance.
Correct.
And Haile Selassie coined the phrase collective security. So the ideas of self-reliance and collective security, which is embraced by Rastafari, one came out of Marcus, and the other one came out of Haile Selassie. Rastafari also sees Marcus Garvey as a kind of forerunner to Haile Selassie, similar to how some religious person might have seen John the Baptist in the Bible being a forerunner to the Jesus in the Bible. So the Rastafari ones who have a kind of religious connotation, we might see that kind of connection right there. Yes, but Marcus Garvey, we thought, and still hold to be true, created a model not a model for national development only, but a model for diaspora development. So here you have two persons. One was uniting the diaspora, which was about Marcus Garvey. Then you have Haile Selassie, who was actually uniting the continent. And so the idea was, how do you bring these two bodies together now? A united diaspora with a united Africa. Now you can now appreciate how dangerous that would have been for Europe and America in the early 1900s, because that was over 100 years ago. And remember, similar to the war now, you had the war then. You had COVID-19 recently, you had the Spanish flu around that time. Yes, there are a number of things. You had the depression that was emerging. You have a global depression that is emerging right now. So 100 years ago, the times were actually very similar. And so for me, it is not surprising now that a lot of the ideas that were being advanced by a Marcus Garvey then, or by a Howell then, or by a Rastafari then in Ethiopia and Africa is being advanced and revisited today by generations of youth who themselves have been influenced by the work of Marcus Garvey and by the work of Rastafari, which is Haile Selassie. So very, 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 very crucial piece of work. And we know how much the work of Marcus Garvey influenced the entrepreneurship culture in the United States as well. And even how the status quo through people like L.W. Du Bois and many other American scholars fought against the work of Marcus Garvey actively and even used violence against the work of Marcus Garvey in the United States. So it shows you again that the status quo and the imperialists will find local people amongst you to fight against you when you're going to try to change the system. And that still happens today. You still have proponents of this very selfish, self-interest, neoclassical, neoliberalist mindset amongst ourselves as Caribbean people, when we know that that has not worked for the past couple 100 years. So Marcus' work is phenomenal. Similar to Howell's work is phenomenal. And of course, the work of Rastafari, as in manifested through Haile Selassie, is phenomenal in terms of how we create different models for Black people and other disenfranchised people's development experience.
Great. That's why I brought about Marcus Garvey, right? Because, as you mentioned before, he was basically championing dignity, confidence. He was giving agency, to those who were colonized, which you can see these connections with the Rastafari
movement,
philosophy, right? Also, he talks about economic self-sufficiency, right?
Yeah, man.
If you want to be independent, you really need to champion how to be self-reliable, and kind of like champion these independent, in his words, Black economies, right?
Exactly.
There is a strong emphasis on your chapter on self-reliance, as you put it before, Knife, enterprise, and community, right?
Yes.
So how do these principles can be translated into real economic practices and community life? I don't know, in places like the Caribbean.
It's actually being done,
Yeah.
It's actually being done. That's why I find that we refer to ourselves as the Marcus Garvey movement scholars, because we're all part of the Marcus Garvey movement as students on campus. Our brethren Alan, Bernard, and Marlon, Moore, and Kethania, all of us are part of that movement. And many of us live Rastafari. And so we have been for the last 15, 20 years. That has been our focal point. The way we design degree programs, the way we've designed programs for our high schools, all those are embedded philosophies of Marcus Garvey within those programs, because we are the ones who actually designed those programs. So we know that the education element was crucial. Even the pedagogical approach towards education is different as well, because we realize that we will learn different. So we use the experiential learning, the mastery learning approach, reverse classroom approaches, mean techniques that I think more reflect our learning patterns as Caribbean persons. But even we write policies as well. When we wrote the National MSME on Entrepreneurship Policy, that was strongly influenced by all the research that we have done on the models that were being done by Marcus Garvey and other persons as well. So we realize that we have to use models that endogenizes growth. What do I mean by that? We have to use models that ensure that we own and control the way wealth is created within our country. And that's why we focus a lot on the micro, small, and medium enterprises, similar to how Marcus Garvey established what was called the Negroes, the African Communities League. And in the African Communities League, you have the Black Star Line Shipping Company, but it's called the Negro Strategic Corporation. Negro Strategic Corporation were called micro, small, and medium enterprises. We recognize these things. So his work has strongly influenced it in terms of the business itself. Again, the policy that we have written reflects the importance of the MSME. And what we have done is also where there's little support. Because I'm telling you, Andres, we can write policies, but that doesn't mean that the state resources those policies adequately to make them be implemented properly. So in our own networking, we have also projectized some policy recommendations. That means that we get project or encourage people to get project funding to implement these things. So let me say, the status quo, and we're not living in an illusion. Be very clear. I have zero confidence in the Jamaican and the Caribbean status quo / governments to meaningfully resource anything that can make systemic changes in the Caribbean. And in this case, I'm talking about the micro, small, and medium enterprises. That is why, Andres, you find that the idea of sustainable enterprise become important. That is why the ideas of social enterprises become important. That is why ideas of the social and solidarity economy becomes important. And I'm using these words because you have to use these words. But all these ideas are not new ideas for the region. All of these ideas, I'm saying, reflect what is called Columbus syndrome, where people are already discovering things that already exist. But I can show you through an interrogation of our experience, where we have ideas of social enterprises, social economy, solidarity economy, and sustainable enterprises happening in the region for centuries, not decades nor years, but for centuries. We can have a next discussion on those things. But again, I will tell you, if you examine the life of the people, the Maroons and the Kalinaga and the Garafunas and Rastafari people and the Tainos and all those people, you can see all these new models. We, though, are in the position through academia and through policy to incorporate these practices in the policies, but now through our own efforts to projectize these ideas so they can become real businesses. And more, Andres, I am seeing how these things are being adopted. Marcus Garvey was saying that says, black people will not know themselves until their back is against the wall. And I am saying this to say to you now that I am realizing that as a lot of nations across the globe recognize that the regular market neoclassical mechanism is failing, they are adopting a lot of the ideas that reflect a lot of the teachings of Marcus Garvey and many other persons as well, not just Marcus Garvey. So if you think about the work of a Royal Prebish, who spoke about import substitution methodologies, or a Gunda Frank, who speaks about development theories, yes, the New World Group, who are speaking about center of satellite, all of those discussions becomes more relevant today because we realize that the center and the peripheral model has not worked. However, you'll find that Marcus Garvey, who predates all of these persons, are a common thread throughout those societies. Because Marcus Garvey was not only in the Caribbean, he was in Central and South America as well. So those same countries where those scholars emerged later in the 1950s, Marcus Garvey was here from the 1920s and the 1930s pushing these ideas. And I am saying those models are now being implemented in a very real way in countries like Jamaica through the social enterprise model, through the sustainable enterprise model, and through ideas of the social and solidarity economy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to add a couple of things just to point to the issue of the models and what modern organizations can learn. So one of the main things for me, Andres, is how we organize resources from what is considered to be minority groups, right? And this is a practice that we have done very effectively through what we call partners susus and so on. So we have found very creative ways to organize resources among ourselves as persons who are considered to be poor. And so we find very creative ways to pool our resources together for use individually. So we have this notion of partners where individuals will, establish a system, a way in which they say, and I'll probably give you the example of, say they'll get like 12 persons, each who are trying to get to a goal, some financial goal, right? And so what they'll do, they say, okay, everyone will put together, say, $500 per month, right? And so what will happen is that one person every month, a member will get the pooled amount to do whatever they want to do, and they'll contribute to that scheme, for the entire year. So, say for instance, the three of us are doing it. I want to raise a certain amount of money, and we say, okay, so we put together. I'll get that first draw, you'll get the second draw, Knife will get the second draw. And so each of us together will get a total of money that we could then use to kind of, do what we want to do, whether it to be buy land, purchase something, infrastructure, purchase equipment, whatever the situation is, right? And so Garvey's approach, Knife mentioned to you how he kind of pooled resources through shares in his company. So that is an example of a model that we could look to, and persons have used this model successfully over the years. It has been something that has been even taken on by financial institutions as an approach to building money, right? So it has been something that it is something that started informally with something that we got from our African ancestors, this idea of esusu, where we pool together resources that we then use as individuals. So we pool together resources, and that's something that has worked very efficiently, very effectively for our countries.
Especially amongst women, Eddie. Especially amongst women.
Especially amongst women as groups that are normally excluded. As usual. That happens all over the world. That's crazy. The other thing is clustering. The idea of understanding that, we are part of an ecosystem, right? The creative and cultural industry does it very well, understanding that we are part of a system, we are part of a supply chain. And so we can actually pool together our resources to make our impacts bigger. Right? We've seen that happen in many different sectors, especially as I said before, in the creative and cultural industry, where we understand that as a product, people want different things. They want the accessories, they want the music, they want the fashion, they want the shows and different things, so different elements. Understanding that you don't have to do everything yourself. You could put together and be a part of a supply chain, a value chain, that you can contribute to and actually benefit from as well. And the last point I want to mention here is how you can execute business within a very hostile environment, right? So Marcus Garvey and Howell, they had to be fighting against the state. And this is not, again, if you think about the state, they have infinite resources, right? And so they're able to, if you're able to build a business despite of the state, that's something that we need to look into, because Marcus Garvey, he was persecuted at many different points, both in Jamaica and in the US, and he was still able to build a business. Leonard Howell as well, in his building of Pinnacle, there were at least 3 occasions in which the Pinnacle was raided and it was destroyed by state agents, and yet still was able to build a community, right? So we're seeing that even under immense challenges, under immense, restrictions, they were able to build sustainable businesses by
again, you mentioned the issue of agency. So ensuring that persons, in the case of Howell, he made sure that there were people with different skill sets. So you had bakers, you had different people with different skill sets who made up an important part of ensuring that this community was self-sufficient. So they had all the different artisans that they needed to make their community work, right? And so these are some of the models that we can really draw on to really speak to what we need as sustainable businesses, sustainable enterprises in this kind of era that we're living in today.
So, from your perspective, what does a sustainable enterprise look like through a Rastafari lens? How is it different from mainstream business models? Because
All right,
I agree,
let me-
like Marcus Garvey's UNIA and Howell's Pinnacle community, right? You actually make examples of this in the chapter. But, you know, how do you see this through a Rastafari lens?
all right, let me give you a quick example then.
Okay.
Because Rastafari, and I think I spoke about it, in the Rastafari, the ones who embrace the most eco-centric approach would have been the ones who live what was called a Nairbingi live, and they are primarily involved in agriculture-related activities, with ganja, where you call cannabis, being the most valued product. Now, the whole idea of a sustainable enterprise prioritizes environmental sustainability while creating all the other values, the economic value, the social value, and the cultural value as well. You'll find now that unlike regular farmers who will use these inputs that are synthetic, Rastafari have its own standard, not a standard that has been ratified internationally, but a standard that is based on what is called Livity. Livity means no synthetic, artificial, or any harmful inputs must be used in any part of the process along the entire value chain. Note, along the entire value chain, even the mindset. So you'll find that when you go onto a Rastaman farm, you cannot even be engaged in any form of argument with sounds conflicting. So the entire environment, the space itself, have to have a certain kind of energy around it. So the seed selection, the soil use. So we're going to do ITAL farming, which goes beyond, ITAL farming goes beyond organic farming, you know, because organic farming might also include the use of certain animal inputs as well, and certain other inputs that we do not consider to be ITAL. So it goes beyond organic farming practices. Yes? So you want to use the most natural approaches towards whatever you're doing. So you're talking about making your own compost and your own compost teas. You know, you think about proper post-harvesting facilities. You're thinking about natural ways of preserving things. So you're talking about freeze drying, or you're talking about solar drying, you know, dehydrating stuff. But importantly, even in the marketing of the product, while we know that it's important to do business a particular way, we also know that not everybody will be able to buy. So you'll find that a Rastaman, while he's selling to make money, he's also very conscious of the needs of people. So you'll find that when you go into a marketplace, this is quite, not a marketplace, but anywhere, if you have people on the road who are asking people for things, so they are begging for things, they are more likely to approach a Rastaman to ask him for something than a non-Rastafari person, because they know that the Rastafari version of the mindset of wanting to care and to share. So even the attitude, you'll find that Rastafari version might be more inclined to barter with somebody else. than a regular business person will be inclined to bartering. So the entire business process is very, very, very different. Bear in mind that we understand the importance of money. But would I tell you something, Andy? Do you know that Rastafari do not refer to money as money? We refer to money as germs. Let me
No, I
repeat it.
didn't. Okay.
We refer to money as germs, not as money. Because we recognize that there's something inherent within this money thing here that creates conflict. And so while we understand the use of money, we emphasize its functionality. Its functionality. Some of us do not even touch money. We do not touch it because we recognize there's something about it that transmits this kind of, and by the way, I mean, it is a, you have some Rastafari brethren that you cannot give them any money. They're not interested in it. Those are the ones who are probably the most extreme. Those are the ones who are the most kind.
100%.
They are the ones who can give you all this food.
Yeah, because they are not attached
Exactly.
to such a material world. I mean,
No, they
in
don't.
the end of the day, money is just a symbol of attachment. And
Exactly.
this kind of like expression of the material world.
As a matter of fact,
If you are able to live, and coexist with the world.
Listen to a song by Peter Tosh, where he says the song which him says, the day the dollar dies. Peter Tosh actually have a song which says the day the dollar dies. The dollar there being money.
Okay.
And he's showing you that this economic system is going to crash the day the dollar dies. But people are going to live beyond the crashing of the system. So life is worth more than money. I win. An artist sing the song that life is worth more than money, house, and vehicle. So we understand the function of money. But you're right. We go beyond the attachment and speaks about the functionality of. And so you use it for that purpose. So the whole model of a sustainable enterprise is one which goes beyond the monetary value. We recognize the intrinsic value of all the things that we use and the things that we produce, and you maintain practices that are sustainable along the entire value chain. So if you're talking about clustering to reduce for create economies of scale, we will be clustering. If you're talking about creating your own system, so you are self-sustained, we are going to create that system. So all those things are a part of it. What is wonderful about this though, Andres, is that even though we are here on this program talking about these things, those are things that are written down. Those are things that are understood as practices of how we live. You don't need to write down those things. We're saying to you that this is how we live. You don't need to read a book to know these things. It is a part of your lived experience. And so the knowledge becomes experiential rather than through secondary data.
Yeah.
But I find with many other people as well. These good practices are never really written down. It takes somebody like yourself to say, what knife and Ellie? Why you don't write a paper on sustainable enterprises and Rastafari? That was not something that came in our minds to be writing down. But in reality, that's how we do every day. That's how we live every day. So we're excited when we say, oh, God, let us write it in Eddie because this is what we have been doing. Similarly, when I was doing my PhD in sustainable development, firstly, I wanted to do my master's was in economics. And then I said to myself, but there's no economic system that can solve the problems that my people faces. So I didn't do a PhD in economics. Then I said, what should I do? I said, well, I want to help people. Let me do something in sociology. But then I realized that no, that was not it either. And then I became exposed to the idea of sustainable development. That is over 20 and 30 years ago. In 1998, I said, okay, I'm going to do my PhD in sustainable development. Then what do you think I realized? I realized that this might be the easiest work that I would ever do. Why? Because my Livity as Rastafari reflects the ideas and the ethic of sustainable development in the most eco-centric way. So I was very excited now about and I was writing on long-term dynamic strategic planning techniques like foresighting and scenario planning. But as Rastafari, you're always thinking about the long term. We took all the far eye. Where do we see our people and our development? So I was so excited about doing this PhD work. Essentially, I was saying that my PhD work maps well onto my livity as Rastafari. So the first part of the work, we speak about the environmental ethics, and all those ethics was very simple for me to write. The other elements about the foresight and scenario planning were ideas that were recognized that these are not new ideas. These are new words, not new concepts. And how do we link it now to make it become relevant to Jamaica is what I was able to do in my PhD work, you know? So I'm saying the whole thinking of sustainable development is not a new concept to Rastafari. These are just new words. This is how we live as Rastafari. And I'm saying this is how many of our people in the Caribbean live. Remember that in places like Jamaica, we have ideas that says you must never cut a bearing tree. So you cannot prune a tree when it is bearing fruit. We also accept that you must plant the child's neighbor string. And you know what a neighbor string is? When the baby has the umbilical cord. We argue that you must get the umbilical cord of the baby and plant it near a tree. Because as that tree bears and prosper, so will that child bear and prosper.
Mm.
That's what I mean? We argue we do not cut flora near springs. So there are many unwritten rules and practices, not just within Rastafari, but within the Caribbean live, that shows a respect and appreciation for the environment in the deepest sense.
Mm.
What we have done is that we have unlearned those processes and adopted bad practices. But as time goes on, we are reminded of the wisdom within the practices of our grandparents. And we are in the position not only to justify it academically, but to live it in a very practical way.
Yeah. One of the things which I really like about the chapter, it was also a critical approach, you know? Anybody who's gonna listen to this podcast, they say, oh, they are super over positive about Rastafari and his practices and so on. But what I like is that you guys raise that is not all Rastafari practices these principles in the same way, right?
Exactly.
So what tensions or contradictions exist within the movement itself?
Rastafari. It has to do with the foundation and principles of the philosophy and the ethic. And you'll find that while Rastafari is not a religion, you have some Rastafari people who are religious. And those amongst I and I who are religious, they use the Bible as a guidepost for their practices. And you'll find that the people who use the Bible as a guidepost for their practices they place less value on the environment and more on the teachings of the Bible. And so you'll find that contradiction right there. So if you have a Rastafari ones with the Bible, he would not be somebody who's a vegan. He might probably say, all right, he might go still wear leather shoes, he might go wear some leather clothes. They'll do all of these because those things are permitted. You know? So the contradiction comes with the philosophical underpinning. If you're religious in your practices, it reflects that environmental ethic. If you're non-religious and nature-centered, which is what we call aeration-centered, you're going to find that eco-centric environmental ethic. So that is where and you'll find that the people who are also religious might want to deal with politics. The ones who are non-religious, not dealing with so that is it now. The extremes are really those who are religious as against those who are nature-centered. Nature-centered, strong environmental ethic. Religious-driven, less strong environmental ethic. However, bear in mind, Andres, that regardless of the fact that somebody is religious, they will never disagree in an open discussion with the man who's nature-centered said, no, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. He's going to continue to practice what he's practicing, but he's not going to openly disagree with what you are practicing as a nature-centered person.
Yeah. Do you think, guys? Please,
so for me, I think, as with other established religions, you have different kind of denominations. You have different. So I think naturally with our Livity that is as open as Rastafari is, the different interpretations will then naturally come up. So you have different people living in a different. I guess part of it for me is about kind of how you live, and we try to use kind of the emergence of each house or mansion. So again, the 6,000 to 7,000 word, I think, wouldn't do justice to some of the work that we want. So we had to cut back a bit to kind of
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that this conversation was so important, man.
Yes. Yeah. So again, I had to take on some of that work, and I just ensured that some of it was edited so we could get fit within that chapter requirement that you had. But we really tried to give you some of the background in terms of the emergence of each house or mansion, right?
Yes.
In terms of how, you had central figures who were critical to the development of each of the movements, how their own worldview kind of shaped how each of the houses or mansion kind of functioned, right? And so naturally you'll have differences, again, in terms of, some aspects of how they practice, how the way of life is practiced or lived. And so naturally you'll have those types of tensions, I feel, right? But as I said, because of the constraints of the chapter in that way, in terms of, the word limit, we had to limit how much you could have said about, just the emergence. But I think there was enough to kind of give you a sense of, how the different leaders are the persons who kind of were pioneers of the worldview, how and why they kind of framed their mansion or houses in particular way, and how they developed based on these leaders in a sense.
Yeah. So listen, two things. So, I was wondering whether you are born Rastafari or you can become Rastafari. Okay. And there is a deeper ethical question here. Can modern businesses truly be sustainable within the current global system? Or does the system itself need to be changed radically in order to, reach out such a number? Yeah.
All right. Let me address that. People say that Rastafari is a inborn concept, meaning now that, as far as I cited, everyone is born Rastafari, but that everyone manifests that livity of Rastafari. Meaning now that intrinsically, all of us are tied and connected to nature. Intrinsically, we're tied and connected to nature. But over time, the socialization process might take you away from that connection, and you start to practice something else, which leads to your point of businesses. In reality, prior to the advent of certain forms of enterprises, so for example, like the big industrial revolution, practices were very different. And the system was very different. But we have had that process for the last couple 100 years. So it actually seems to be the norm. But in truth and in fact, that could not have been the norm. Something that happened for 400 years, since the emergence of Columbus, can't be the norm when the earth has been around for thousands and thousands of years. What was there before? So you might find, Andre, that if you go and examine business practices prior to this kind of dispensation, they might have been classified as sustainable enterprises, even though there weren't this big concern about the environment, because there was no big concern about the environment prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, to get to your other question about whether they can have, whether the current businesses can practice sustainable enterprise or the system has to change. All things are in a state of constantly becoming. There's a process, and you're right. The system will have to change.
Yeah.
It has to change. So, I mean, that things has been changing. It happens that for the past 400 years, things have been changing for the worse. But we are saying, going forward, things have to change for the better. You know? And the beauty about it is that even these youths who are being born today, the Gen Z and the Delta generation, the Gen Z or the I generation, one of their characteristics is that they have a strong sense of community and community development. They are also being born in a time where there's a greater awareness and consciousness about the importance of the environment. So I have no doubt that things are changing, the systems will be changing. You know what happens though? If you think about it, Andre, who are the key decision makers now? The key decision makers are persons who are socialized in an analog age, which is socialized by the idea of selfish self-interest, and that the environment is harsh towards us. The Generation Z youths and the Delta generations are the first set of youths who are being fully immersed in a reality where are saying, no, that anthropocentric human-centered approach is unsustainable. And I'm going to tell you that within the next 5 to 10 years, as time progresses, these bad practices are going to be seen as strange practices. When somebody is going to do something without thinking about any form of circular economy or recycling, it is going to be a very strange practice. We're going to say, but how are you doing this without thinking about that? So I'm very positive. I'm saying the Rastaman vibration is always positive. So I'm very positive about what the emerging future is going to be like. If it's for one simple reason, many of us who perpetuate unsustainable practices are going to die. We're not going to be around. And many of those who are embracing these sustainable practices are the ones who are going to live, which are the young youths. You know, it just means that people like yourself, Andrea, have to continue to put out these kinds of information that these youths can constantly access to recognize that, yes, there's a different path towards development. We have made errors over the last couple 100 years, but life is eternal. And so we can continue to make positive changes going forward. So I agree with you. The system will have to change, and the system will change. It will change, and it's changing. That's why we're having this podcast now. Having this podcast, we write in these chapters, having all these discussions is evidence of the process of change that is taking place.
Yeah. You know what I was thinking, guys? Like, you were exemplifying, one of the examples how can Rastafari can be manifested in business practices is organic agriculture, right?
Yes.
And I was thinking, man, but it's really worrying, I would say, like sustainable food or organic food or plastic-free products are only accessible to certain elite because they are extremely expensive, man. I mean, you go to the supermarket, right?
That's very expensive.
Yeah, and 500 grams, I get 1 kilo of apples is significantly more expensive than, a kilo of GOM apples.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
And that is right. But you know, though, Andrew, so that is also a part of a deception. Let me tell you what I mean. I can only speak from our own context here. Again, I'm sitting under a mango tree. And I have at least 2 or 3 of most fruit trees planted where I live. Most of those are wasted, even when I give away so much. And this is not this is a mango tree, but when I say it's an organic mango tree, there's no organic, it's a mango tree. Not that it is organic. But if I want to increase the price, I'm going to say I'm going to sell you organic mangoes. That's what I mean. So we use, and I'm talking about places like our places. I'm not talking about other developed countries that have big orchards and do all these spraying and all these pesticides. I'm saying in traditional Caribbean, American societies where we have trees and fruit trees naturally. We have those. So the fact is, some of our people have adopted that kind of marketing style because organic food, in the way they have done it, is really a marketing strategy. Because you do have to brand them as organic because they are just natural. Why it becomes not all right? So if this is an organic mango, and the other one over there has not been planted with any synthetic fertilizers, what does that make that one? Is it inorganic? No, it's organic. But it's beyond organic. It is ital. You know what I mean? So we create these things, but you're right. And it's part of the market system. The market has made it so difficult for people to access good food deliberately. Yes, still we know that more than 40% of all foods produced globally is wasted. And those are things that are produced. So what about the foods that occur naturally that is not produced? They are also wasted. So is there really a shortage of clean food? Or is there a problem with distribution and post-harvesting? So the problem is really with the post-harvesting of the natural food and the distribution of the natural food. So we are able to distribute bad food and harvest bad food, but we choose not to harvest the good food. It's almost in economics when talk about a public good. Yeah. Them say, oh, it is difficult to sell a public good because it's hard to price, etc. Similarly, where you are from, who's going to price the mango tree that grows on the street openly? You can't price that, but you're going to price the one in the supermarket. And so we can put a big price on the poison product in the supermarket, but we can't price the product that is freely accessed by the people in the street. So more and more people are going to become aware of. And again, so the distinction between what is called organic and synthetic is going to become a bit redundant, like the next couple of decades from now. But currently, because we're in the transition processes, that's going to happen. But I'm telling you, a couple of decades from now, the norm is going to be what is called organic or ital. When you're using things that are synthetic, it's going to be seen as abnormal practices. So the process is going to reverse, I think, in the next couple of decades or before.
So that's interesting for me now, because I think when you were talking, I was thinking about this idea of, GMO products, the seedless fruits and so on, yeah, which have become a natural part of what. So the fact of the matter is, as I said before, in our context, we still see it as being what happens naturally. So yeah, you get the natural fruit off the tree. We don't need to make a distinction about organic or not, right? But in other spaces where there's a big thrust towards maximizing, trying to get as much fruits as possible with in terms of genetically engineering certain stuff has become a way of, in terms of how you do it. You have to, so it then becomes a situation where the natural organic food becomes the minority, which is then why it is kind of marketed in that way, because it's becoming the minority in a sea of unnatural engineered products. We're hearing stuff that they're doing lab grown meats now and all these things. So I look at these things coming on stream again in the name of profits, and we talk about the issue of sustainable enterprises, and this is what we talk about, which is why the concept in many cases is kind of foreign, because we're thinking about it in terms of how we naturally do things.
Yes.
Right? As opposed to, again, and I always say it in this way, a lot of times things that are happening are just new concepts, but these are things that we've been doing for a long time.
Yeah.
And so that is,
in reality, it's true. Like when you harvest certain products, you really need to find like natural strategies in order to, fight against insects, germs, weather change, and so on. I think it's just laziness sometimes. Because
But
you know,
Andrew, let me tell you something. See. You see, it's this thing about these germs and this money, man. You see, the money is a problem. So when you think about it, I went to Germany for a conference and I drove about 240 kilometers. I was observing.
200. Okay.
Yes. I did not see one fruit tree. Not one. And I said to myself, okay, that is why for these countries, when they have threats of war, it is very serious. Because there's no food in that country for them to consume. It's not like we who grow in the Caribbean,
No.
where the fruit trees are all around you. So I get some better insight as to why these people create those artificial ways in which they live, because they don't have the natural way to live. That is why they like to come to our places as tourists, because it is the first time them actually ever feel free to experience nature in a very loving, friendly way. So if you note, a lot of these sciences around GM food emerge in those same societies that Hobbes spoke about. What is bad though is that some of our people in our places think that they should adopt those, which is not relevant to our reality. So you see, the mindset again is where it comes in. That's why we're saying that in the abundance of water, the food is thirsty. And you can see in a very literal way, where in the Caribbean spaces, we do not go to the springs to fill our water bottles, even though we have springs, but we go into a supermarket to buy a purified water. I'm saying this to you, Andres. This is what I say, really, because for the last 20 odd years, 30 odd years, every water that I drink in Jamaica comes directly from the spring. I go to the spring with my 5-gallon bottles and fill them up at the spring. Fill them up. See? But I go to the spring and see people with a bottle of water that they purchase. These are the persons who live near the spring now. Buy the bottled water and actually throw the empty bottle at the foot of the spring. They're not refilling the bottle with the water at the spring, you know. They're using the bottled water, plastic bottle, to create garbage near the spring and go and buy the next bottle of water at the shop when the spring is right there in front of you. That's how people can get into your mind. That's even you have the resources in front of you, you abandon that resources to buy something that they have manufactured, which is not as good as the one that you have left out. But again, there's an increase in consciousness and awareness now. As the increase in consciousness about the environment becomes greater, people's appreciation for things in the natural environment will also improve. And that's why I'm saying that my outlook is positive. Because as people become more aware of the environment, we're going to become more aware of our first environment, which is our own self, our own body itself, what we call the goodie, you know? And so you're going to want to treat yourself the best. So in a short while, you're going to find that many of these things, I think, are going to change, you know? But for now, we can see it, you know? We have the resources, but because we're deceiving to believe that those resources don't have any value in their natural state, we go and try to get them in a very processed or unnatural state, which actually creates problem. The footprint, the environmental footprint. You think about it. What's the environmental footprint of setting up a water processing facility as against going to the spring to get the water for yourself?
Fantastic. Listen, just the last question, guys, because thank you so much. We are almost 3 hours or something, right? So
well,
for
you'll
you
find that,
both,
Andre, you know. I can tell you something, a danger. There's one danger reason with Rastafari about Rastafari. Time doesn't exist.
yeah, it's a human invention. Don't worry about it. I know.
All right, well, continue, please.
For you both, looking ahead, do you see a real shift happening globally towards these more eco-centric and inclusive approaches?
You want to go first and then because I might talk longer?
Go ahead, Naf.
All right. Andres, yes. A big, big yes. There's no other way to go. There's no other way to go, you know, except towards these eco-centric approaches. The youths who are being born today, as I mentioned before, the Generation Z or the I generation, Delta, they already have that kind of attitude. We are seeing a lot more practices becoming important in Jamaica and other Caribbean territories. The whole idea of environmental sustainability with an eco-centric approach, the whole idea of vital livity is being embraced more and more. The whole shift that is towards this health and wellness consciousness globally is part of what is fueling the embracing of eco-centric philosophies towards the environment as well. You know, so I'm very, very certain, very, very positive that this is what is going to happen and is actually happening. The speed of which it should be happening is where we might be concerned about, you know, because everywhere you look around, you can see all the poisons, but you're not seeing the big emphasis. But it's happening, and it's happening in a very consistent way. And again, I'm saying that the fact that we are having discussion on this podcast is a part of the evidence that this is a part of the awareness and the consciousness that is happening out there as well. So definitely, I mean, I argue that this is the age of Rastafari. And why I say it's the age of Rastafari, because we argue that Rastafari do not believe, Rastafari know. This is the age of knowing. You know, the previous Piscean age, which is the age of belief, has been replaced by the Aquarian age, which is the age of knowing, mentalism. And what happens is that the more people know, is the more they will do. You could have tricked persons into believing that what you're doing is correct. But right now, because of access to information, these youths are going to say to you, no, we are not going to use this artificial thing. We're not going to use this synthetic project because we know that that is causing harm to the environment. We also know that if you do A, B, and C, it will be positive for the environment. So the access to information and knowledge is going to make a fundamental difference, because world leaders are no longer able to deceive people by hiding information about the harmful effects of some of their practices or about the good effects of other practices. And in the age where there is no longer asymmetric information, but people have full access, people are going to be able to make them decisions for themselves. Which is what Rastafari says. Bob Marley said in his song, you have a mind of your own. So you go to hell if what you're doing is not right. Yes? Love will never leave us alone. You're in the darkness. You must come out to see the light. Yeah. The knowledge, the information is going to allow the fueling of a generation of new ideas and new thoughts, where we see ourselves as not being separated from the environment, but being one in it. Not the most important element in it, you know, but still a very important element, with the responsibility of ensuring that whatever we do doesn't harm current or future generations, but create a positive impact on the entire ecosystem across flora and fauna, across plants and animals. So the outlook is very positive and optimistic.
He's very Rastafari, no?
Right. So from my perspective, Andres, I think we are gonna be confronted with what I consider to be mutually assured destruction if we don't take. So I think what we're gonna have to do is to see the environment is responding, and
Yes.
you know, we have to then respond to that response to the environment. We've seen it in many different ways and forms, whether through non-communicable diseases, whether through adverse weather conditions, that how, you know, the traditional business model has to change, right? We're seeing it in terms of practices. We're seeing the rise of things like a circular economy. People understand that we cannot keep using the resources that we have in an unsustainable manner, right? So there's enough evidence of changes happening. And part of it, as I said, is being forced on us because of the response from Mother Nature in its many ways and forms. And so the change will happen, even if it means it being forced on us. You know, we have to make the changes as well. So Knife gave you kind of the positive spin on the fact that we, as enlightened people of enlightened self-interest, will see the need to make that positive change. But from the self-interest perspective, we're going to be forced to make some of the changes as well.
Yeah.
Guys, that was a great wrap up. Thank you so much for giving up this time to talk about this. And the chapter was fantastic. I'm looking forward to the final manuscript. As you know, we have other scholars talking about other practices in the world.
Yes.
And I think we need to try to find a way to do a little bit of, together, I don't know, conference or something about this topic.
Man, the advocacy is crucial. I think the books, very important, very, very important. And again, it substantiates the fact that things are changing. I mean, 20 years ago, no one might have been interested in a book like this that you're putting together.
Yeah, true.
In reality, a couple of years from now, this book might be one of the best readers for persons who want to get insights on some of these things. So things are really changing in a positive way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you guys. Have a lovely day.